Man's conquest of nature is an expression often used to describe the progress of applied science.
Man has nature whacked, said someone to a friend of mine not long ago.
In their context, the words had a certain tragic beauty, for the speaker was dying of tuberculosis.
No matter, he said. I know I'm one of the casualties.
Of course, there are casualties on the winning as well as on the losing side.
That doesn't alter the fact that it is winning.
I've chosen this story as my point of departure in order to make it clear that I do not wish to disparage all that is really beneficial in the process described as man's conquest, much less all the real devotion and self-sacrifice that has gone to make it possible.
But having done so, I must proceed to analyze this conception a little more closely.
In what sense is man the possessor of increasing power over nature?
Let us consider three typical examples: aeroplane, the wireless, and the contraceptive. In a civilized community, in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things.
But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he is exercising his own proper or individual power over nature.
If I pay you to carry me, I am not therefore myself a strong man.
Any or all of the three things I have mentioned can be withheld from some men by other men, by those who sell, or those who allow the sale, or those who own the source of production, or those who make the goods.
What we call man's power is in reality a power possessed by some men, in which they may or may not allow other men to profit by.
Again, as regards the powers manifested in the aeroplane or the wireless, man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor, since he is the target both for bombs and for propaganda.
And as regards contraceptives, there is a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive.
By contraception, simply they are denied existence. By contraception used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer.
From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men, with nature as their instrument.
It is, of course, a commonplace to complain that men have hitherto used badly and against their fellows the powers that science has given them.
But that is not the point I am trying to make.
I am not speaking of particular corruptions and abuses which an increase of moral virtue would cure. And considering what the thing called man's power over nature must always and essentially be, no doubt the picture could be modified by public ownership of raw materials and factories and public control of scientific research. But unless we have a world state, this will still mean the power of one nation over others.
And even within the world or the nation, it will mean in principle the power of majorities over minorities, and in the concrete of a government over the people.
And all long-term exercises of power, especially in breeding, must mean the power of earlier generations over later ones.
The latter point is not always sufficiently emphasized because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by always including time among the dimensions.
In order to understand fully what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, you must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction.
Each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors.
This modifies the picture which is sometimes painted of a progressive emancipation and a progressive control of natural processes resulting in the continual increase of human power.
In reality, of course, if any one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power.
They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which has thus attained maximum power over posterity were also the age most emancipated from tradition, It would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as drastically as that of its successors. And we must also remember that quite apart from this, the later a generation comes, the nearer it lives to that date at which the species becomes extinct, but the power it will have in the forward direction because its subjects will be so few.
There is therefore no question of a power vested in the race as a whole steadily growing as long as the race survives.
The last men, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future.
The real picture is that of one dominant age, let us suppose the 100th century AD. Exists all previous ages most successfully and dominates all subsequent ages most irresistibly, and thus is the real master of the human species. But within this master generation, itself an infinitesimal minority of the species, the power will be exercised by a minority smaller still. Man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. I am not yet considering whether the total result of such ambivalent victories is a good thing or a bad. Only making clear what man's conquest of nature really means, and especially the final stage in that conquest, which is not far off. Final stages come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by an education and propaganda based on perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. We shall have taken the thread of life out of the hand of Clotho. The battle will indeed be won. But who precisely will have won it? For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. In all ages, no doubt, nurture and instruction have in some sense attempted to exercise this power. The situation to which we must look forward will be novel in two respects. In the first place, the power will be enormously increased. Hitherto, the plans of educationalists have achieved very little of what they attempt, and indeed, when we read them, how Plato would have every infant a bastard nursed in a bureau, and Eliot would have the boy see no men before the age of 7, and after that no women, and how Locke wants children to have leaky shoes and no turn for poetry, we may well thank the beneficent obstinacy of real mothers, real nurses, and above all, real children for preserving the human race in such sanity as it still possesses. But the man-molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique.
We shall get at last a race of conditioners who really can cut out all posterity in what shape they please.
The second difference is even more important. In the older systems, both the kind of man the teachers wished to produce and their motives for producing him were prescribed by the Tao, a norm to which the teachers themselves were subject and from which they claimed no liberty to depart. They did not cut men to some pattern they had chosen.
They handed on what they had received. They initiated the young neophyte into the mystery of humanity which overarched him and them alike.
It was but old birds teaching young birds to fly. This will be changed. Values are now mere natural phenomena.
Judgments of value are being produced in the pupil as part of the conditioning.
Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive of education.
Conditioners have been emancipated from all that.
It is one more part of nature which they have conquered. The ultimate springs of human action are no longer for them something given.
They have surrendered like electricity. It is the function of the conditioners to control, not to obey them.
They know how to produce conscience, and decide what kind of conscience they will produce.
They themselves are outside, above.
for we are assuming the last stage of man's struggle with nature. The final victory has been won. Human nature has been conquered, and of course has conquered in whatever sense those words may now bear.
Conditioners, then, are to choose what kind of artificial Tao they will, for their own good reasons, produce in the human race.
They are the motivators, the creators of motives.
But how are they going to be motivated themselves?
For a time, perhaps, by survival, with their own in mind of the old natural Tao.
Thus, at first, they may look upon themselves as servants and guardians of humanity and conceive that they have a duty to do it good. But it is only by confusion that they can remain in this state.
They recognize the concept of duty as the result of certain processes which they can now control.
Their victory has consisted precisely in emerging from the state in which they were acted upon by those processes to the state in which they use them as tools.
Of the things they now have to decide is whether they will or will not so condition the rest of us that we can go on having the old idea of duty and the old reactions to it.
How can duty help them decide that?
Duty itself is up for trial. It cannot also be the judge.
Good fares no better.
They know quite well how to produce a dozen different conceptions of good in us.
The question is which, if any, they should produce.
No conception of good can help them decide.
It is absurd to fix on one of the things they are comparing and make it the standard of comparison.
To some, it will appear that I am inventing a factitious difficulty for my conditioners.
Other, more simple-minded critics may ask, why should you suppose they will be such bad men? But I am not supposing them to be bad men.
They are, rather, not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Good and bad applied to them are words without content, for it is from them that the content of these words is henceforward to be derived.
Nor is their difficulty fictitious. We might suppose that it is possible to say, after all, most of us want more or less the same things. Food and drink and sexual intercourse, amusement, art, science, and the longest possible life for individuals and for the species. Let them simply say, this is what we happen to like, and go on to condition men in the way most likely to produce it. Where's the trouble? But this will not answer. In the first place, it is false that we all really like the same things.
But even if we did, what motive is to impel the conditioners to scorn delights and live laborious days in order that we, and posterity, may have what we like?
Their duty?
But that is only the Tao which they may decide to impose on us, but which cannot be valid for them.
And their final conquest over nature has not really happened. The preservation of the species?
But why should the species be preserved? One of the questions before them is whether this feeling for posterity, they know well how to produce it, shall be continued or not. However far they go back or down, they can find no ground to stand on.
Every motive they try to act on becomes at once petitio.
It is not that they are bad men. They are not men at all.
Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void.
Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men.
They are not men at all. They are artifacts.
Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man.
Yet the conditioners will act.
When I said just now that all motives fail them, I should have said all motives except one.
All motives that claim any validity other than that of their felt emotional weight at any given moment have failed them. Everything except the sic volo sic jubeo has been explained away. But what never claimed objectivity cannot be destroyed by subjectivism.
The impulse to scratch when I itch or to pull to pieces when I am inquisitive is immune from the solvent which is fatal to my justice or honor or care for posterity. When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains.
It cannot be exploded or seen through because it never had any pretensions.
The conditioners, therefore, must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure. I am not here speaking of the corrupting influence of power, nor expressing the fear that under it our conditioners will degenerate.
The very words corrupt and degenerate imply a doctrine of value and are therefore meaningless in this context. My point is that those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse. We may legitimately hope that among the impulses which arise in minds thus emptied of all rational or spiritual motives, some will be benevolent. I am very doubtful myself whether the benevolent impulses, stripped of that preference and encouragement which the Tao teaches us to give them, left to their merely natural strength and frequency as psychological events, will have much influence. I am very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside traditional morality and attained power, has used that power benevolently.
I am inclined to think that the conditioners will hate the conditioned.
So regarding as an illusion the artificial conscience which they produce in us their subjects, they will yet perceive that it creates in us an illusion of meaning for our lives which compares favorably with the futility of their own. They will envy us as eunuchs envy men. But I do not insist on this, for it is a mere conjecture.
What is not conjecture is that our hope even of a conditioned happiness rests on what is ordinarily called chance. The chance that benevolent impulses may on the whole predominate in our conditioners.
For without the judgment, benevolence is good, that is, without re-entering the Tao. They can have no ground for promoting or stabilizing these impulses rather than any others. By the logic of their position, they must just take their impulses as they come, from chance. And chance here means nature.
It is from heredity, digestion, the weather, and the association of ideas that the motives of the conditioners will spring.
Extreme rationalism, by seeing through all rational motives, leaves them creatures of wholly irrational behavior. If you will not obey the Tao, or else commit suicide, obedience to impulse, and therefore in the long run to mere nature, is the only course left open. At the moment then of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men, and those individuals subjected to that in themselves which is purely natural, to their irrational impulses.
Nature, untrammeled by values, rules the conditioners, and through them all humanity.
Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. Every victory we seem to win has led us step by step to this conclusion. All nature's apparent reverses have been but tactical withdrawals. We thought we were beating her back when she was luring us on. What looked to us like hands held up in surrender was really the opening of arms to enfold us forever. If the fully planned and conditioned world, with its Tao a mere product of the planning, comes into existence, nature will be troubled no more by the resistive species that rose in revolt against her so many millions of years ago. It will be vexed no longer by its chatter of truth and mercy and beauty and happiness.
And if the eugenics are efficient enough, there will be no second revolt, but all snug beneath the conditioners, and the conditioners beneath her till the moon falls or the sun grows cold.